The year is 1975. The date is June 12th. Justice Jagmohan Lal Sinha of the Allahabad High Court has just delivered a stunning judgment in the case of Raj Narayan versus Indira Gandhi. In our last video, we had discussed the background of this case in the Allahabad High Court and the story of its principal players. If you haven't seen part 1, please do so before you continue watching this. If you have watched part 1, you know that a team of underdogs had just unseated Indira Gandhi, the most powerful person in the country, with the help of the legal system. The Prime Minister was convicted for employing corrupt practices to win the 1971 elections. The Allahabad High Court declared her election void and barred her from holding any public office for 6 years.
She was disqualified for 6 years from 75. So till 81, if the judgment had remained, till 81 she could not have contested any election.
That would have been the end of Mrs. Gandhi's political career, because she couldn't remain in office after that, at least for the next 6 years. And therefore it was imperative for her to get a stay of that judgment, because that judgment otherwise takes immediate effect. So her lawyers asked the judge immediately after the judgment had been pronounced and after the initial shock had worn off, they realized that they need to get a stay of that judgment, and they therefore went to the judge's chambers and asked him to stay the judgment for some time to enable her to file an appeal in the Supreme Court, and therefore the judge granted a 20-day stay to enable her to approach the Supreme Court.
The petitioner, Raj Narayan's lawyer, Shanti Bhushan, was not in Allahabad on that day.
I believe if I had been in Allahabad, I would have successfully prevented that stay order being given. Why should you stay order so to enable a Prime Minister to continue, about whom you have recorded a finding that she lied in court? So I perhaps would have prevented a stay order being granted. If that had happened, probably the history of the country would have been different. Emergency would not have taken place because she would have had to resign. Somebody else would have, probably Jagjivan Ram would have become Prime Minister, and therefore he would have continued.
The moment the stay of the judgment was granted, Indira Gandhi summoned a man whom many considered the best lawyer in the country at the time and is still seen as one of the greatest advocates India has ever produced, Nani Palkiwala.
So it seems that immediately after the judgment of the Allahabad High Court, Mrs. Gandhi got in touch with Mr. Palkiwala, and it was he who thereafter prepared the stay application and argued the stay application.
The Supreme Court was on vacation at the time, given that it was June. However, there was a vacation judge who would preside over the matter, the newly appointed Supreme Court Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer. On June 22nd, he got a call from H.R. Gokhale, the law minister who was a close advisor to Indira Gandhi.
Gokhale, my close friend, he telephoned me. Krishna Iyer, I want to meet you. He did not expect my response. I said, why do you want to meet me? A reply which he did not expect, because when the law minister says, I want to meet you, I would say, please come. On the other hand, I said, why do you want, please tell me why you want to meet me? Because I had also some suspicion that not things were so straight. They were trying to influence me and get a stay. So I said, why do you want to? He said, the Prime Minister's election has been set aside. She wants to file an appeal and move for stay. I said, if you want to move for stay before me as a Supreme Court judge, go to the Supreme Court, not to be at home.
The hearing of the stay application was the very next day. Justice Krishna Iyer had chosen the Chief Justice's court to hear the case, and the Supreme Court premises were teeming with people.
When they began the argument, I did not want this case to be postponed. Usually they postpone, and things never get an end. And the whole nation was in tension. Here is a Prime Minister, very powerful Prime Minister. Her election has been set aside. What is this judge going to do? So, I told Pankiwala, how long will you take? I must finish this case today, 3 hours. The other man, 3 hours. Then I said 1 hour for response. But that means I cannot have lunch, then I won't be able to finish the case. I said, I forgo my lunch. The advocates both of them said, we also forgo our lunch. I said, we'll continue. From 10 o'clock, we went on arguments till 5:30 and finished the case.
Palkiwala was asking for an absolute stay order. I was saying that no stay order.
But I did not remove her.
Conditional stay.
Conditional stay, and continued her saying, I am not for a coup in the country for the sake of this particular petition.
The condition was that she would not be allowed to vote in Parliament.
But she will be entitled to function as Prime Minister without having the right to vote as a member of Parliament.
She can't vote, she can sign only for minimum number of days. She can't vote.
So with that condition, the judgment was stayed, and thereafter the appeal came to be heard.
The conditional stay was granted on the 24th of June. Immediately, a number of opposition leaders led by Jayaprakash Narayan demanded Indira Gandhi's resignation. It was then that Indira Gandhi decided to take the most dramatic step any Indian Prime Minister had ever taken, spurred on by her son, Sanjay Gandhi.
It was the Allahabad High Court judgment which made her position totally untenable. And if she had some sense, she would have followed her initial impulse, which lasted no more than 5 minutes. That she should temporarily withdraw when she wins the case in the Supreme Court, can come back in a big way, hold election and all that. But then her son, by which time established as an extra constitutional authority, and openly the dynastic principle had begun, he was their successor, he said, no nonsense, you will not withdraw even for a minute. And then of course the emergency became unavoidable. Because when the Supreme Court Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, he gave only a conditional stay and not full stay. I think she had no choice but to leave. Unfortunately she didn't. And once she decided not to leave, then she could not have survived. Unfortunately, she just could not have survived without locking up the opposition leaders and censoring and suppressing the press.
On the night of June 25th, 1975, Indira Gandhi got President Fakhruddin Ali Ahmad to declare a state of emergency, unleashing a reign of terror the likes of which had never been seen before in India.
Mrs. Gandhi cited the reason that that the integrity and the sovereignty and the security of the country were threatened by internal disturbances. She said that the opposition was planning to spread chaos in the country, was planning to create civil war-like conditions in the country, and therefore it was essential to impose an emergency to quell these internal disturbances created by the opposition, and that is why fundamental rights were suspended and all these opposition leaders were put in jail. But of course it was obvious that it was only done to protect her position because of this judgment, and thereafter the campaign by the opposition, which was a peaceful campaign, to ask her to get her to resign.
It was terrible. The country's total ethos changed overnight. The world's largest democracy, with a single stroke of the president's pen, becomes one of the numerous tin pot dictatorships with which the third world was then infested. And 100,000 people were arrested and jailed. This is the number equal, more or less, to what the British arrested in the whole 1942 movement. Then there was unspeakable harassment of much larger number of people.
You see, in the early months of emergency, the whole nation was shocked. Fear Because if a people like Jai Prakash Narayan, Morarji Desai, and all the top leaders, Atal Bihari, Advani, etc., Madhu Dandavate, everyone could be detained, then it was such a fear complex that nobody could speak at anything. So trains were running on time, officers were going, but the atrocities which were committed, they started increasing. Sanjay Gandhi's compulsory sterilization program, allotting quotas to every government officer and teacher. You have to get so many people sterilized. So in order to complete the quota, they used to get hold of any person who was within their control and get him sterilized. Young people, bachelors were sterilized. Everything happened. Then colonies, jhuggi jhopadis were being bulldozed without providing them alternative. Police officers were misusing their powers for their personal this thing. They were arresting anybody. So fear complex was there.
And in the midst of this emergency, Indira Gandhi dropped more bombshells through her law minister H.R. Gokhale in Parliament in August 1975.
A series of amendments were pushed through in this truncated parliament because a lot of the opposition was in jail. And these amendments were essentially designed to take away the basis of her being held guilty of corrupt practices.
The Election Laws Amendment Act 1975 amended those specific sections of the Representation of the People Act 1951 under which Indira Gandhi had been charged with corrupt practices. So where she had been charged with procuring the assistance of gazetted officers for furthering her election prospects, a proviso was added stating that if a government servant assists a candidate by reason of the office held by the candidate, it would not be deemed assistance for the furtherance of the prospects of that candidate's elections. Since the Allahabad High Court had stated that the date of resignation of her agent Yashpal Kapoor from the government office he held would be the date on which the official order accepting the resignation was passed and not the date that had been mentioned in the Gazette notification, an explanation was added stating that a date of resignation mentioned in the Gazette would be considered conclusive proof that the officer had ceased to be in the service from that date. Similarly, amendments were made to nullify every single charge levelled against Indira Gandhi, and all these amendments would operate with retrospective effect and hence would apply to the 1971 elections.
But that was not all. After these amendments in the election law, a constitutional amendment was also brought, the 39th Constitutional Amendment, which provided that the election of the Prime Minister cannot be set aside. Essentially what it said was that it cannot be challenged and cannot be set aside by any court. So it essentially validated her election, and that was also with retrospective effect. So therefore it was a constitutional amendment designed to validate her election. It was extraordinary.
I used to give this example when I spoke in Bangalore. I said, supposing there was a cricket match between a Bangalore team, Allahabad team, and Bangalore team played very well and they scored a huge number of runs and got Allahabad team out for a very small score, the umpire would have declared that Bangalore team has won. But we, Allahabad team, would have told him, don't forget we come from Allahabad, which is the seat of the Prime Minister. We have the power to change the laws, and we are changing the laws of cricket hereafter. The new laws which will apply to this game also will mean if you hit the ball so hard that it goes outside the boundary, it will not be a sixer, it will be out. and if the ball hits the wicket, it will be a boundary. So now you judge the match again with these new rules. The umpire will have to say, yes, Allahabad team has won, Bangalore team has lost.
What's more, the 39th Amendment also placed the Representation of the People Act 1951 along with the Election Laws Amendment Act 1975 in the 9th schedule of the Constitution, ensuring that they were beyond the purview of judicial review. The amendments had been passed just before the hearing of the appeal in the Supreme Court. The 5-judge bench consisted of Chief Justice A.N. Ray and Justices Khanna, Beg, Matthew and Chandrachud. Just 2 years ago, all 5 judges had sat on the 13-judge bench of the landmark case of Kesavananda Bharati versus State of Kerala, in which the Supreme Court, by a narrow 7-6 majority, had held that the legislature cannot make amendments to the Constitution that alter its basic structure. However, 4 of the 5 judges, including Chief Justice A.N. Ray, had been in the dissenting minority. Indira Gandhi had not taken kindly to the Supreme Court's majority decision in Kesavananda Bharati and had seen to it that Justice A.N. Ray was made the Chief Justice of India, superseding 3 judges who were more senior. The 3 judges who were superseded promptly resigned in protest. It was a well-known fact that Chief Justice Ray did not agree with the basic structure doctrine. Incidentally, Indira Gandhi's lawyer in the stay application, Nani Palkiwala, who had championed the doctrine in Kesavananda Bharati, had returned her brief the moment she had declared the emergency. Now, Shanti Bhushan had to argue basic structure in the appeal.
The argument was at that time that they are against the basic structure. Actually, what had happened was that though that was not a constitutional amendment, those amendments in the election law, they were amendments in the Representation of People Act. But they were introduced into the 9th schedule of the Constitution, and once you put something in the 9th schedule, you make it immune from challenge on the ground of violation of fundamental rights. Though they become immune from challenge on the ground of violation of fundamental rights, they can still be challenged on the ground of basic structure, because even a constitution amendment can be challenged on the ground of violation of basic structure. By putting something in the 9th schedule, you have amended the constitution by putting it in the 9th schedule. Therefore, this can be challenged on the ground of basic structure.
A.N. Ray asked me, what is this basic feature? What are the basic features of a constitution? How do you identify them? I said, look at my junior, J.P. Goel. I said, these are the days of organ transplants. So I said, supposing he was carried to an operation theatre and the surgeon was told to transplant all his organs, everything except his left thumb. Every part of the body would be transplanted, some other person's part would be placed. So when he is being wheeled out of the operation theatre and his wife has put this question, do you recognize him as your husband? And she will look at him and she will say, no, he is not my husband. And the surgeons would say, no, look at his left thumb. She would say, no. So I said, since the various organs which have been transplanted change his identity, he becomes a different person. That's the theory of basic structure. Which are those vital parts of the constitution which give it a particular identity. Secularism, democracy, if you change and say it will be now we are amending the constitution, the prime ministership will go by heredity, and Prime Minister will become the dictator. No majority of the Parliament, etc. will bind. There won't be any Parliament, etc. Only a President will be there, who will be Mrs. Gandhi and her successors. So this change could be made, but then is the Constitution still the same Constitution? Is there no difference between the same Constitution modified and a Constitution replaced? The power of amendment does not imply replacing the Constitution, only amending it, mending it, making changes here and there, but not replacing the identity.
So on the 39th constitutional amendment, the arguments were whether this violates the basic structure or not. And obviously my father's argument was that it violates the basic structure. On the other side, they said that no, this is only validating one election, therefore there is no violation of the basic structure, etc., etc. The Supreme Court finally agreed with my father's argument that it violates the basic structure, and that was struck down. But on the other issues of the election law amendments to the Representation of People Act, the court unfortunately held that those election law amendments cannot be challenged on the ground of basic structure. They can't be challenged on fundamental rights, they can't be challenged on basic structure, and therefore they said that they are valid, and therefore once they are valid, then obviously her election is validated, because the whole basis of declaring her to be guilty of corrupt practices had been taken away by those retrospective amendments, and therefore on that basis her election was upheld.
So this is how the story of Raj Narayan versus Indira Gandhi ends. Indira Gandhi's election was validated, the emergency continued, as did the judiciary's darkest days with the now infamous judgment in the ADM Jabalpur case. Of course, things eventually got better. The emergency was withdrawn by Indira Gandhi in 1977, and in the subsequent elections, she was soundly defeated by a united opposition. But it was a troubled coalition that fell apart quickly, and Indira Gandhi was back in power in 1980. We tend to have short memories about these things, but the case of Raj Narayan versus Indira Gandhi needs to be remembered for the lasting impact it had on our history, politics, and law. Not only did it trigger an emergency, but it also revealed how vulnerable our legislature, judiciary, and press are to a person with power and ambition. Let us never forget that democracy was taken away from us for 19 months. Let us never allow that to happen again.